welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Today in the show, we have Stephanie Wottrich. She is a medical student and she wrote the Kevin MD article, "Joy is our antibiotic. Let not your stings fester." Stephanie, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Dr. Poe. I appreciate it. Great to be here.
We'll get into your article in a little bit, but first off, can you share your story and journey to where you are today?
As I mentioned, I'm a fourth-year medical student in Cleveland, Ohio. I go to Case Western Reserve University. I'm originally from Austin, Texas, though. I did my undergrad out at UCLA, so on the West Coast, and I lived in Korea actually before I moved here. So I'm kind of making a circle, is what I tell people.
You're in your fourth year of medical school, so now you're applying to residencies. Over to your medical school journey, what's something that you know now that you wish you knew back before you started that journey?
Actually, one of the things that I feel I've been able to learn over the last few months, especially in light of the pandemic, is I've been spending more time with a friend who's been emphasizing how important it is sometimes to take time just to be, if that makes sense. Not even necessarily in a state of meditation, although of course that's also great. I love yoga, I love things like that, but not constantly being in motion, because I would consider myself as a person that gets a little bit addicted to efficiency at times, especially as a med student. It constantly feels like I have to be doing something. And over the last few months, I've been realizing that it can be therapeutic even just to push everything aside and just sit and not do anything at all. So that's something I've been working on, at least personally, trying to be a little bit more forward about in my own life.
So give us an example of what exactly that looks like, because I think what you're referring to is being present in a moment. And I think that sometimes as a medical student, especially, very, very difficult with the amount of things that you have to do. So give us an example of something that you've changed in your own life in order to follow your friend's advice.
So one of the things that I really like doing, especially these days, because the weather is literally perfect outside, is I will just leave my house and I will walk down to, there's something called Wade Oval at our school. It's like a lake, and there's some trees, and I will just go there and I will sit and I won't do anything. I don't go with anyone. I just sit and enjoy the weather. And I try to think about not so much my day, but just reflect on things that maybe happened or feelings I felt throughout the day. And I don't go for more than, 5-10 minutes. It's a nice walk. It gets me outside. And it's really nice to not feel the pressure of having to do something, like go somewhere with an intent, with a plan, with a time schedule. Like I just go. And sometimes if I can't go that far, I'll just go sit out on my porch 10 or 15 minutes and come back inside and get back to work. And it's very healing, in my opinion.
Wow, it's wonderful advice. And sometimes it's important to take those moments whenever we can get them. So let's talk next about your Kevin MD article, "Joy is our antibiotic. Let not your stings fester." Now, for those who didn't get a chance to read your story, can you just walk my audience through it and share the story of why you decided to write it?
So as I mentioned early on in the article, pretty much the whole meat of the story is based on a dream I had about a year ago, right around Christmas time. But it was a very unusual dream. I've had very vivid ones before, but this one I remembered very intricately every detail, despite the fact that I also woke up in a state of sleep paralysis. And usually when that happens, I'm, gripped by fear. I instantly forget the dream, start freaking out. But I woke up and I was laying there, not moving, and I was focusing on this dream that I had. And I'm not really one to say that interpretation of dreams has meaning or some kind of subconscious manifestation of anything. It could, I don't know. But while I was sitting there, I was thinking to myself, this seems very significant, especially in this day and age, as I mentioned, where wellness is becoming, I think, more important and more emphasized to students and healthcare workers, but it's still definitely a work in progress, I think. And so in the dream, in summary, basically, I get very sick in the dream, and of course, it doesn't really make sense as it is a dream, but it felt very real. And I end up with like bones falling out and teeth falling out. And it sounds very dramatic, but in the dream, it's very scary. And when I woke up, I thought, what is this telling me? What can I take away from this? And the biggest thing I thought was, okay, it's like something that started very small. It started as a bee sting in the dream, became something very big. And I started thinking about how emotions and feelings can be like that too. When you don't say anything and you just internalize all of that, it can become something very big from very tiny things.
So how do you think those lessons from that dream can be applied to what you're going through as a medical student?
So I definitely think it was, at least for me, a renewal of the importance of wellness, and emphasizing taking time for yourself to do things that give your life meaning and things that you're passionate about. And these are things that I think they're discussed, as I mentioned, among med students. We have sessions about wellness, it's talked about, but it's still very much the culture, at least in my experience, that med students are kind of tacitly expected to constantly be working, constantly be doing something. And sometimes it gets to the point even where you start neglecting your wellness, you start neglecting things that are good for you, whether it's exercise or some kind of sport or reading, whatever activity that might be. And I really do think over time that becomes very damaging. So I wanted to get my thoughts out on paper, not just to emphasize to me, but potentially anyone that might read the article, that it's something you don't always think about, why you feel the way you feel, but you just know you're annoyed or you're angry. Everything feels like it's built up inside and you don't really know why. And sometimes it's from really small things that become a really big problem.
So wellness and burnout has been at the forefront on my blog, on this podcast. We talk about it in all levels of medicine, whether you're attending, resident, or medical student. So
Mhm.
from a medical student standpoint, when you gather with your fellow colleagues and talk about wellness, what exactly do you guys talk about?
Well, personally, as I mentioned, I love yoga.
Hmm.
And I think that that's definitely growing in popularity these days. So oftentimes when I'm talking with either attendings, like when I was on my integrative medicine and wellness rotation, or friends, I'm constantly telling people like, oh, I know it seems weird at first. I thought it was weird too, but it's weirdly kind of calming, like if you give it a try. But there are other types of meditation too, like there are apps called Headspace, which I've tried. It was a long time ago, but there's just so many options. And so whenever we kind of bring up either apps or yoga or whatever it is, it always turns into this conversation about things that we've tried, things that work, things that don't. And I think that that's really important to have that conversation, not just with colleagues, but again, like I mentioned, with some of my attendings. During my wellness rotation, we talked about different resources that they often will mention to patients. And I mentioned some things that I've done. And it's always very productive. It kind of seems weird to bring up, at least in a medical standpoint, at least at first. But like I said, it's just always been a very productive conversation in my experience.
When the topic of wellness comes up, is that mostly driven by the students themselves, or is it driven by administration?
That's actually a really good question. I've never thought about it. I feel kind of split. Definitely the administration is constantly telling us, oh, wellness is important. We do get emails as well saying they're doing this wellness event, or sometimes they give out things like cookies or snacks to students. And they've recently started doing yoga in our brand new medical building as well. So I do think it's becoming more and more emphasized among administration. But the students, I was surprised. A lot of people really do think it's important as well. And so whenever, there are these events going on, people will often text each other and ask who's going, who's not. And there's actually a lot of interest in it among at least our group chats and my own smaller chats. So it seems to me like it's pretty split in terms of both administration and students finding it very important.
So you're in your fourth year of medical school, and as you approach the end of your medical school journey, what kind of changes would you make if you were in charge of medical education? What kind of changes would you make to emphasize wellness in a curriculum?
So I honestly think that some of the new changes that have been being made, are really good. And I think that it would have been great if those had been implemented even beforehand. So for example, the yoga that they've started offering on Fridays, even for people who don't go, just knowing it's an option, I think is really important. Our campus gym as well has been offering more wellness activities. They do guided meditations and things like that. And I think it's also really great, not to say the pandemic is great, but just that there's been such a move toward virtual meetings, virtual resources, everything's becoming virtual these days. And I think that that really helps make things accessible to people. So I wish that that had been more of a thing. Even back when I was a first year, including like even residency interviews, things like that. It can be really helpful for putting people at ease so that they're able to, from a financial standpoint and from a comfort standpoint, do things where it's most comfortable for them and in ways that's most comfortable for them. And that way there isn't such a stress and such an emphasis on having to be somewhere, having to do something, having to, it's less constraining, I think, both in terms of the accessibility to activities and in terms of accessibility to things that, we already have to do, clinicals and interviews and things like that. But it's a lot more positive in my opinion.
I know there's a trend in medical education to make things pass-fail. For instance, I know some medical schools have their preclinical courses pass-fail, and I know USMLE Step 1 is pass-fail. Do you think that would help in terms of the stress medical students face?
I do think so. In fact, a lot of the med students talk among each other about how they can, I won't say put off the exam, but it's just, we're so close to the point at which Step 1 is becoming pass-fail. A lot of people are taking research years. They're finding other activities to do in between so that they can take the exam a little bit later, knowing that that won't be a component really of stress, since most people, we get a dedicated study period. So it's like when you take those few months to study, you're going to pass. It's just the stress comes from knowing how good or how bad you're going to do. So I definitely think that takes a pretty big degree of stress away from students. And I would say in terms of clinical grades, I'm not too sure. I think, a positive thing overall. I definitely think the general consensus is that it relieves stress. For example, our first clinical, when I was a third year, when we started rotations, the administration had us do a vote. Our class voted on whether or not the first block, so the first, I think, like 3 months, would be pass-fail versus graded, since traditionally case is always just grades. And the majority did vote for it to be pass-fail. So I don't know how it would have been otherwise, especially because we were just transitioning back to the hospital after COVID and everything was so different. So I think there was a degree of just uncertainty as well. But I'm inclined to believe it definitely does at least take some of the edge off and having to, not only transition into this new era of COVID where we're taking care of COVID patients or even around that, as well as transitioning into third year at the time. So there was just a lot of things going on that could still cause stress. At least that wasn't a component of it.
We're talking to Stephanie Wottrich. She is a medical student and she wrote the Kevin MD article, "Joy is our antibiotic. Let not your stings fester." Stephanie, what are some of your take-home messages that you want to leave with your fellow medical students and the Kevin MD audience?
So what I would say, the biggest thing that I've been learning over this time, especially since the beginning of quarantine and since writing this article, is the importance of taking care of yourself and really emphasizing wellness and emphasizing doing things that give your life meaning, and things that you are passionate about. And that can look like many different things. And I think it's really important to find one or more things that you really like and cultivate it, but not just keep it to yourself. Do your best to share it with other people, because I think that sharing your talent, sharing your gift is an act of love to other people. And ultimately, the greatest talent, the greatest gift we can give is learning to love others and teaching others to love by setting an example. So, and I would also definitely emphasize that meditation comes in many different forms, and it's important no matter who you are. There's many different ways to do it, and you can, give it a try and just see what may or may not work for you. There's a quote by the Dalai Lama that I really like, and I apologize if I get it wrong, but it's something like, if every 8-year-old were taught meditation, we would eliminate violence within 1 generation. And I really do believe that that's true. So I definitely think it's something that everyone should at least try.
Stephanie, thank you so much for sharing your time and insight. And thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you, Dr. Poe. I appreciate it.